Oblivious to the storm hammering his windshield and distorting the diner's neon sign into bloody smears, Zio focused only on his pulsing migraine and the cheap cigar burning his knuckles. Suddenly, a body slammed onto the hood of his sedan. She wasn't a hitman. It was just a kid, maybe 18, her eyes blown wide with a terror that tasted like copper. And right behind her, a shadow stepped out of the alley. Water pooled in the deep crevices of the leather seats. Zio stared through the glass, his hand hovering over the ignition. He was tired. A deep, bone-scraping exhaustion that had settled into his marrow sometime over the last decade of running the family's downtown operations. He had come to the back alley of this diner for 10 minutes of silence. 10 minutes away from the ledgers, the hushed phone calls, the smell of cheap cologne his lieutenants bathed in. Instead, he got a dent in the hood of his Lincoln. The girl scrambled backward, her wet sneakers squeaking against the slick metal of the car. She looked like she had been dragged through a gravel pit. The right knee of her jeans was torn open, exposing a mess of scraped flesh and dark blood. Her hair, plastered to her skull by the freezing rain, was a mousy brown. She didn't scream. That was the first thing Zio noticed. People usually screamed when they were cornered. She just panted, her chest heaving violently under a soaked, oversized grey hoodie, her hands desperately searching the smooth surface of his hood for something to grip. A man emerged from the narrow gap between the diner and the adjacent brick wall. He was breathing hard, a wet, rattling sound that carried over the rhythmic drumming of the storm. He held a heavy steel tire iron by his side. The street lamp caught the silver edge of it. Zio sighed. A slow, heavy exhale that fogged the glass. He didn't want to be involved. A smart man rolled the window up, threw the car in reverse, and let the street sort out its own garbage. The city was full of wolves and rabbits. It wasn't his job to police the food chain. But the girl's eyes locked onto him through the windshield. They weren't pleading. They were feral, trapped, utterly devoid of hope. It annoyed him. It reminded him of things he spent a lot of money on expensive whiskey to forget. He shoved the car door open. The hinges groaned. The cold hit him instantly, biting through his wool overcoat. The smell of wet garbage, rotting leaves, and gasoline filled his lungs. He stepped out, leaving the door open, the dome light casting a pale yellow glow over the wet asphalt. "Get off my car," Zio said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the rain. It had the gravelly, resonant weight of a man who was entirely used to being obeyed. The girl flinched, sliding off the hood and hitting the ground. Her ankle gave out, and she crumpled against the front tire, hugging her knees to her chest. The man with the tire iron stopped, and he was broad-shouldered, wearing a waterlogged canvas jacket. Water dripped from the brim of his baseball cap. He looked at Zio, then at the open car door, calculating. He didn't recognize Zio. That meant he was either an out-of-towner, an amateur, or a junkie. "Mind your business, old man," the guy spat, stepping closer. "The bitch stole from me. Walk away." Zio didn't move. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of his sidearm. He didn't draw it. He pulled out a silver lighter instead. He sparked it, shielding the small, weak flame with his cupped hand, and relit the stub of his cigar. The pungent smell of tobacco mixed with the rain. "I don't care what she stole," Zio said, blowing a thin stream of smoke into the wet air. "I care that she put a dent in my hood, and I care that you're standing in my puddle, interrupting my goddamn break." The man gripped the tire iron tighter. His knuckles went white. "I'll put a dent in your skull if you don't step aside." It was the wrong answer. Zio felt a familiar, cold numbness wash over him. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a quiet, mechanical precision. He didn't adopt a fighting stance. He just took one step forward. "Try," Zio said softly. The man lunged. It was a sloppy, heavy swing, telegraphed a mile away by the drop of his shoulder. Zio simply pivoted on his heel. The iron bar whistled through the empty space where his head had been a fraction of a second before. Before the man could recover his balance, Zio brought his knee up, burying it squarely into the man's ribs. Bone cracked. A sharp, wet, snapping sound. The man wheezed, folding forward. Zio didn't hesitate. He grabbed the back of the man's canvas jacket, hauled him downward, and drove his elbow into the back of his neck. The man hit the wet asphalt face first. The tire iron clattered into the gutter. He didn't get up. He lay there, twitching slightly, blood pooling from his nose and mixing with the rainwater flowing toward the storm drain. Zio stood over him for a second, catching his breath. His own heart was beating a little too fast. His back twinged. He hated physical labor. He turned his head. The girl was still huddled against his front tire. She was shivering violently now, her teeth clicking together audibly. She stared at the unconscious man, then slowly looked up at Zio. "Get in the diner," Zio muttered, tossing his cigar into the puddle. "Before I decide to bill you for the bodywork." The back door of the diner locked behind them, with a heavy metallic thunk. The interior smelled intensely of industrial bleach, burnt coffee, and old frying oil. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, buzzing like a swarm of dying wasps. Zio walked past her, his heavy leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He went straight to the coffee machine sitting on a stainless steel prep counter, pulled a chipped ceramic mug from the rack, and poured. The liquid was thick, black, and had been sitting on the burner for at least 5 hours. The girl hovered by the door. She was dripping a puddle onto the clean floor. Under the harsh lights, she looked worse. Bruises in the shape of fingertips were blooming on her pale neck. Her lips were blue. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs, her eyes darting to the locked door, then to the windows, then to the heavy chef's knife resting on a cutting board 10 feet away from her. Zio saw her tracking the knife. He didn't care. If she tried for it, he'd break her wrist. He pushed the coffee mug across the counter. It stopped an inch from the edge. "Drink it," he said. "You're going into shock." She hesitated, then took slow, careful steps toward the counter. Her wet sneakers squelched. She reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the mug. The ceramic was blistering hot, but she didn't seem to notice. She wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat sink into her skin, and took a small sip. She grimaced at the bitter taste, but swallowed. Zio pulled a stool out from under the prep table and sat down. He unbuttoned his overcoat, letting it hang open. He didn't offer her a towel. He wasn't running a charity. He watched her. She wasn't crying. Her breathing had leveled out, but the adrenaline was still holding her together like cheap glue. Soon the crash would come, and she'd be useless. "You have 5 minutes to tell me why you're dragging garbage into my alley," Zio said, his voice flat. She looked up at him over the rim of the mug. Her eyes were hazel, flecked with green, but shadowed by dark, heavy bags. She looked older than 18 now. She looked like someone who had been running for a long time. "I didn't mean to hit your car," she said. Her voice was raspy, raw from the cold. "I don't care about the car." Zio leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. "I care about the guy bleeding into the gutter outside. You stole something from him. What was it?" She swallowed hard. Her grip on the mug tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Money. Enough for a bus ticket." "Lie." Zio didn't raise his voice. He stated it as a simple fact. A guy like that doesn't chase a girl through 3 miles of rain-slicked alleys for bus fare. He had the walk of a man who was under orders. He wasn't angry. He was desperate. Desperate people are afraid of what happens if they fail. Who does he work for? The girl looked away, staring at the stainless steel sink. I don't know. Strike 2. Zio stood up. The stool scraped loudly against the floor. I don't do charity cases, kid. If you're going to lie to me, I'll open the back door and drag you right back out to the puddle. By the time he wakes up, you'll be exactly where you started. Panic flared in her eyes. It was real, sharp, and visceral. She took a step back, hitting the edge of the counter. No, please. You can't. I can. And I will. Zio walked toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. He looked down at her. He could smell the damp cotton of her hoodie, the metallic tang of the blood on her knee, the sour smell of raw fear. Do you know him? She stared at Zio's chest. She was trembling again, the mug vibrating in her hands. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was a sudden, strange shift in her posture. The panic fractured, giving way to something hard and brittle. Yes, she whispered. I know him. Who is he? She took a slow, rattling breath. The answer didn't come out as a plea. It came out as an executioner's drop. His name is Arthur, she said, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow monotone. But you used to call him Artie. He's the one who wired the ignition on your wife's Cadillac 5 years ago. He told me the story. He told me how the glass melted. The fluorescent light above them popped. Zio stopped breathing. The diner vanished. The smell of bleach and burnt coffee disappeared, replaced by the suffocating stench of burning rubber, scorched paint, and charred meat. The phantom heat of a blast wave rippled across his face, a sensation so real he could feel the skin tighten on his cheekbones. He stared at the girl. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic dripping of water from her clothes hitting the linoleum. What did you say? Zio's voice wasn't his own. It was a hollow rasp, pulled from the bottom of a very dark, very deep well. He told me to run, she continued, her hazel eyes locked onto his, unblinking. When he realized who owned this diner, he told me to run here. He said if I found Zio Rossi, I was supposed to tell him that Elias says hello, and that Elias wants his daughter back. The mug slipped from her numb fingers. It shattered on the floor, splashing hot, black coffee over Zio's shoes. Neither of them moved. Zio looked at the broken ceramic shards scattered across the linoleum. Dark liquid seeped into the grout lines. He felt a strange numbness spreading from his chest outward, paralyzing his limbs. 5 years. 5 years of turning the city inside out, breaking fingers, kicking down doors, torturing low-level runners in damp basements, trying to find the man who had paid for the bomb. Elias Thorne, his former right-hand man, his brother in everything but blood. The man Zio had supposedly watched die in a warehouse fire 3 weeks after the Cadillac exploded. The score was supposed to be settled. The earth was supposed to be salted. Now, a wet, bleeding teenager had just dug up a corpse and dumped it on his kitchen counter. Daughter, Zio repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He looked back up at her. He really looked at her this time, past the bruises, past the wet, matted hair. He looked at the shape of her jaw, the slope of her nose, the green flecks in her hazel eyes. A cold spike drove itself directly into the base of his skull. My mother was Sarah Bennett, the girl said, her voice steadying. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a grim, survivalist focus. Elias took me when I was 13. After she died, he kept me locked in a house up in the Berkshires. He said it was for my own protection. He said my real father was a monster who got everyone he loved killed. Zio's hands began to shake. He shoved them deep into the pockets of his overcoat, clenching his fists until his fingernails bit into his palms. Sarah. He hadn't heard that name in almost 2 decades. Sarah had left him before he had truly taken over the family. She had hated the life. She had run. He had let her go because it was the only decent thing he had ever done. He raised me, she went on, stepping over the spilled coffee, forcing Zio to hold his ground. He taught me how to move money, how to scrub ledgers. He used me to keep his new network invisible. I thought he was protecting me from you. What changed? Zio asked. The words felt mechanical. He was functioning on pure instinct now. The tactical part of his brain was fighting a desperate war against the emotional hemorrhage happening in his chest. I found the files, she said, wiping a streak of dirty rainwater from her cheek. I saw the surveillance photos of your wife. I saw the receipts for the explosives. He didn't hide me from you to protect me. He kept me as a contingency plan. A hostage he could cash in if you ever figured out he was still alive. She reached into the front pocket of her soaked hoodie. Zio tensed, his hand dropping over his pocket, but she just pulled out a small, waterproof plastic pouch. Inside was a black USB drive. This is his whole network, she said, holding it out. Bank accounts, shipping routes, the names of the politicians he's buying. It's everything. Artie, the man outside, caught me pulling the files from the main server. He chased me here. Zio looked at the drive. It was a tiny piece of plastic. It held the key to destroying the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for 5 years. But he didn't reach for it. He looked at the girl, his daughter. He felt entirely unprepared. He knew how to break a strike, how to launder $1 million through a string of dry cleaners, how to bury a body so deep even the devil wouldn't find it. He didn't know how to look at an 18-year-old girl who had his eyes and a head full of poison planted by his worst enemy. "Why give it to me?" Zio asked. He leaned back against the counter, suddenly needing the support. "If you think I'm the monster Elias said I am, why bring me the gun to shoot him with?" She let out a short, cynical laugh. It sounded utterly joyless. It sounded exactly like the laugh Zio gave when a rival offered a bad deal. "Because a monster is exactly what I need right now," she said. She lowered her hand, holding the drive tightly. "Elias owns the cops. He owns the FBI field office. If I go to the law, I'm dead before morning. You're the only person in this city with enough hate in your heart to actually kill him." She wasn't asking for a father. She wasn't asking for a tearful reunion. She was making a business transaction, her life, for her tormentor's head. Zio stared at her. The cynicism, the cold calculation, the absolute lack of sentimentality. She was a survivor. She was a Rossi. He walked past her, ignoring the USB drive. He moved to the heavy metal security door that led to the front of the diner. He slammed his fist against the steel twice. 10 seconds later, the lock clicked, and the door swung open. 2 men stood on the other side. Sal, thick-necked and scarred, and Marco, young, twitchy, and heavily armed. They looked at Zio, then peered past him at the girl. "Sal," Zio said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "There's a guy bleeding in the alley out back. Drag him inside. Tie him to a chair in the basement. If he dies, I'll break your legs." Sal nodded, his face turning grim. "Got it, boss." "Marco?" Zio continued, not breaking eye contact with his men. "Lock down the block. Nobody in, nobody out. Call the doctor. Tell him to bring a trauma kit." "Who's hit?" Marco asked, his hand dropping to his belt. Zio finally turned around, looking back at the girl standing alone in the harsh fluorescent light, clutching the plastic pouch like a lifeline. "Nobody yet," Zio said quietly. "But a war just started." He walked back to her, reaching out his hand, not to take the drive, but to gently grip her bruised shoulder. She flinched, but he held firm, his thumb brushing against the cold, damp fabric of her hoodie. "Welcome home, kid. Now, let's go hunt a ghost." The basement of the diner smelled like old yeast and rusted pipes. The air was heavy, damp and stagnant, clinging to the skin like a wet film. A single caged bulb hung from the exposed rafters, casting a jaundiced yellow pool of light over the center of the room. Arthur was awake. Sal had bound him to a heavy, grease-stained oak chair with thick zip ties, pulling them tight enough to bite into the nylon of his waterlogged jacket. His nose was broken, a swollen, purple mass that leaked a steady stream of dark blood over his lips and down his chin. He was breathing through his mouth, the sound a wet, ragged rasp that echoed off the cinder-block walls. Zio stood at the edge of the light. He held a fresh cigar, unlit, rolling it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. He felt numb. A terrifying, absolute void had settled behind his ribs. For 5 years, the idea of finding the man who wired the Cadillac had been a roaring furnace in his gut. It was the heat that got him out of bed. Now, looking at the man, Zio felt nothing but the cold, heavy weight of a ledger that needed balancing. Chloe stood on the stairs behind him, half hidden in the shadows. Zio hadn't told her to come down, but he hadn't ordered her to stay upstairs either. She needed to understand exactly what kind of machine she had just plugged herself into. Zio stepped into the light. Arthur's eyes, bloodshot and frantic, snapped to him. The bravado from the alley was gone, washed away by the concussive force of Zio's knee and the grim reality of the basement. "Artie," Zio said. The name felt like chewing on glass. "You look like shit." Arthur spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the concrete. "Go to hell, Rossi." "Already there," Zio replied, his voice a flat, dead drawl. He stopped 2 feet from the chair. "I'm going to make this very simple. My patients died in a fire 5 years ago. You're going to tell me exactly where Elias is operating from. You're going to give me his security rotations, the names of his local bagmen, and the access codes to whatever bunker he's hiding in." Arthur let out a wet, rattling laugh. "You think I'm afraid of you? Elias warned me about this. He told me you're a dinosaur, a relic. He's going to gut your operations, Io. He already has the feds eating out of his hand. You kill me, and my body turns up on the 6 o'clock news with your fingerprints all over it." Zio didn't blink. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just sighed, slipping the unlit cigar into his breast pocket. He looked over his shoulder at Sal. "Sal," Zio murmured, "get the bolt cutters." Arthur flinched. The bravado cracked, just a fraction. But Zio saw it. The slight widening of the pupils, the sudden rigidness in his shoulders. "You're bluffing," Arthur choked out, straining against the zip ties. The heavy oak chair creaked in protest. "Elias said you went soft after Sarah died. He said you lost your nerve." Zio turned his head slowly. He looked up the stairs, finding Chloe's face in the gloom. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Arthur, her knuckles white as she gripped the rusted handrail. She wasn't looking away. She was forcing herself to watch. "He's right," Zio said, looking back at Arthur. "I did lose my nerve. I stopped caring about the territory. I stopped caring about the shipments. I sat in a big, empty house and drank until I couldn't feel my fingers." Sal stepped out of the shadows, the heavy iron bolt cutters gripped in his calloused hands. They were designed for snapping padlocks. They were heavy, clumsy, and brutal. "But you see, Artie," Zio continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, stepping close enough that he could smell the stale sweat and terror coming off the man. "That was before I knew Elias was still breathing. And it was before I knew he stole my kid." Zio nodded at Sal. Sal didn't hesitate. He grabbed Arthur's left hand, pinning it flat against the wooden armrest of the chair. Arthur thrashed, screaming, his boots scraping frantically against the concrete. Sal was twice his size and possessed the immovable weight of a falling cinder block. He forced the jaws of the cutters over Arthur's index finger, resting the cold iron against the first knuckle. "Where is he?" Zio asked, his face inches from Arthur's. "Berkshires!" Arthur shrieked, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, panicked rush. "A compound outside of Great Barrington. It's an old logging estate. 40 acres. Gated. Heavy security." Zio held up a hand. Sal froze, the jaws of the cutters biting just enough to draw a bead of blood. "The USB drive," Zio said softly. "What's the encryption?" "I don't know," Arthur sobbed, his chest heaving, snot mixed with the blood on his upper lip. "I swear to God, only Elias and the accountant have the key. It's AES 256. It's a dead man's switch. If you try to brute force it and fail 3 times, it wipes the drive." Zio stared into Arthur's eyes. He looked for the lie. He looked for the subtle shift in focus, the twitch of a facial muscle. There was nothing but raw, unfiltered terror. The man was broken. "Sal," Zio said, standing up and straightening his overcoat. "Put him to sleep. Leave him in the trunk of the Lincoln." "Boss?" Sal looked confused. We're moving," Zio interrupted, turning toward the stairs. "Elias knows Arthur was chasing her. When Arthur doesn't check in, Elias will assume the drive is compromised. He'll burn the Berkshires compound and vanish." Zio walked up the stairs, passing Chloe. She didn't shrink away from him, but she didn't meet his eyes either. The smell of copper and fear seemed to cling to her wet clothes. "Come on," Zio muttered, pushing the heavy basement door open. "We need a computer, and we need to get off the street." The safe house was a 3rd-floor walk-up, above a 24-hour dry cleaner in the garment district. The entire apartment smelled violently of perfluoroethylene, a harsh, synthetic chemical odor that burned the back of the throat and made the eyes water. The floorboards were warped, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be entirely invisible. Zio sat at a scarred laminate dining table, watching the blinking cursor on a battered Panasonic Toughbook. Across from him sat David, a freelance contractor who owed Zio his life and his right kneecap. David was thin, jittery, and smelled entirely of cheap energy drinks. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up lines of green code that reflected in his thick-rimmed glasses. Chloe was sitting on a stained floral sofa in the corner of the room. Zio had tossed her an old, oversized wool sweater from a duffel bag in the closet. She was drowning in it, the sleeves rolled up past her wrists. She was eating a piece of stale sourdough bread from the pantry, tearing off tiny, methodical pieces and chewing them slowly. Zio watched her out of the corner of his eye. She didn't eat like a normal teenager. She ate like a stray dog, hunched over, her shoulders tense, her eyes constantly tracking the front door, David and then Zio. It was a physical manifestation of paranoia. Elias hadn't just hidden her. He had systematically dismantled her sense of safety. "She's quiet," David muttered, not looking up from the screen. "You sure she's yours?" "Shut up and type, David," Zio said, his tone devoid of heat, but heavy with warning. David swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Right. Okay. The guy wasn't lying. It's a triple lock AES, 256 encryption. Military grade. It's nested. Can you crack it?" "Crack it?" David let out a nervous chuckle. "Zio, if I could crack this without the key, I'd be working for the NSA, not sitting above a dry cleaner waiting for a bullet. Brute forcing this would take a supercomputer about 4 million years." Zio ground his teeth together. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He looked at the plastic pouch sitting on the table. 5 years of hunting, culminating in a piece of plastic he couldn't open. "There's a back door," Chloe said. The room went dead silent. Only the hum of the dry cleaner's industrial presses downstairs vibrated through the floorboards. Zio turned in his chair. Chloe hadn't stopped eating. She didn't look at them. She just stared at a water stain on the ceiling. "What did you say?" Zio asked. "I said there's a back door." Chloe swallowed the dry bread and finally looked over at them. Her hazel eyes were dull, exhausted. "Elias is paranoid. He doesn't trust digital keys. He thinks they can be stolen remotely. He built a manual override into the partition. A master password." David stopped typing. "A master password? On a drive like this? That's like putting a screen door on a submarine." "He liked having control," Chloe said, her voice tightening. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. "He liked knowing that if everything went dark, the only way into his empire was through a phrase in his own head." Zio stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the warped wood. He walked over to the sofa, stopping a few feet away. He wanted to sit down next to her. He wanted to tell her that she was safe now. But he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had lived in violence his whole life, that if he tried to comfort her, she would reject it. She didn't need a father. She needed a weapon. "Do you know the phrase?" Zio asked softly. Chloe looked away. A tremor went through her shoulders. It was the first sign of genuine emotional breaking Zio had seen since the alley. "He made me memorize the ledgers when I was 15, she whispered, her voice rough. "He said I had to earn my keep. He would sit me in his office, lock the door, and make me recite the accounts. If I got a number wrong..." She trailed off, her fingers digging into the wool of the sweater. He'd type the phrase to open the file. I watched his hands. He thought I wasn't paying attention. He thought I was just a stupid, frightened kid. Zio felt a surge of hatred so pure and intensely concentrated it made his vision blur. It wasn't the hot, chaotic rage of a bar fight. It was cold. It was absolute zero. He was going to take Elias apart, piece by piece. "Come here," Zio said, gesturing to the table. Chloe uncurled her legs. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and walked over to the laptop. David scooted his chair back, giving her space. She hovered over the keyboard. Her hands were shaking. She stared at the prompt on the screen. "Enter key." "It's going to alert him," Chloe said, her finger hovering over the first key. "The drive has a canary protocol. The second the partition unlocks, it sends a ping to a hidden server. He'll know we have it. He'll know where we are." "Let him know," Zio said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He reached under his coat, pulling a spare 9mm magazine from his shoulder holster and checking the brass casings. "We've been hiding from each other for 5 years. I'm done playing ghost." Chloe nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. She placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't type a string of numbers. She didn't type a complex algorithm. She typed a sentence. The fire was necessary. She hit enter. The screen froze for a fraction of a second. Then the black terminal window vanished. The desktop populated with dozens of folders, spreadsheets, routing numbers, blackmail photographs, offshore accounts. The entire anatomy of a criminal empire laid bare. "Holy Mother of..." David breathed, leaning closer to the screen. "We have it. We have everything." Zio didn't look at the screen. He looked at the phrase still burned into his mind. The fire was necessary. It was a justification. A sick, twisted mantra Elias told himself to sleep at night. A sharp, synthetic beep interrupted the silence. David's face went pale. He pointed to a small red icon flashing in the bottom right corner of the screen. "That's the canary. It just chirped. "How long?" Zio asked, racking the slide of his pistol, chambering around. The metallic clack was deafening in the small room. David looked frantically at his watch. "If he has a strike team in the city, and he's triangulating the IP, 10 minutes, maybe less. We need to rip the drive and run." "Rip it," Zio ordered. He turned to Chloe. "Put your shoes on. Now." They didn't get 10 minutes. They got 6. Zio was standing by the window, peering through a small tear in the yellowed blinds. The street below was slick with rain, the neon sign of the dry cleaner casting a sickly green glow over the pavement. A black, unmarked van rolled down the street, its headlights off. It didn't park. It just stopped in the middle of the road, the engine idling. "They're here," Zio said, stepping away from the glass. The heavy, suffocating calm washed over him. The fatigue was completely gone. "I'm at 90%, David yelled, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he copied the files to a secondary hard drive. "Just give me 30 seconds. "You have 10, Zio said, moving toward the front door. He grabbed a heavy oak coat rack and jammed it under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop them, but it would buy a few seconds. He looked back at Chloe. She had her wet sneakers back on, but she was frozen, staring at the door. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. The panic was clawing its way back up her throat. "Chloe," Zio said. His voice cracked like a whip, sharp and commanding. She flinched, her eyes snapping to his. "Look at me," Zio ordered. He walked over to her, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding her. "You are not going back in a cage. Do you hear me? I will burn this entire city down before I let him touch you again. But you have to move. You stay behind me. You do exactly what I say. Understand?" She stared at him. The sheer, overwhelming violence radiating from him wasn't directed at her. It was a shield. For the first time in her life, the monster was on her side. She nodded. "I understand." Thump. A heavy, muffled impact vibrated through the floorboards. They had breached the downstairs door. "Done!" David screamed, ripping the secondary drive from the USB port. He shoved the laptop off the table, the plastic cracking as it hit the floor, and scrambled backward. "Fire escape!" Zio pointed to the back window in the kitchen. "Go!" Footsteps thundered up the wooden stairwell. Heavy boots, moving fast and with military precision. Elias hadn't sent street thugs. He had sent professionals. David bolted for the kitchen. Chloe followed, but hesitated halfway, looking back at Zio. "Move!" Zio barked, raising his pistol, aiming squarely at the center of the wooden door. The doorknob turned violently. The oak coat rack groaned under the pressure. Then, a massive, deafening roar ripped through the apartment. A shotgun slug tore through the door, shattering the wood and obliterating the coat rack. Wood splinters the size of daggers exploded into the room. The sound in the small space was physically painful, a concussive wave that punched the air out of Zio's lungs. A second shot followed, blowing the hinges off. The door collapsed inward in a cloud of dust and plaster. Through the haze, Zio saw the silhouette of a man wearing tactical body armor. Stepping through the frame, a short-barreled shotgun raised to his shoulder. Zio didn't aim for the chest armor. He fired twice, rapidly. The sharp crack-crack of his 9mm cut through the ringing in his ears. The first bullet took the man in the unarmored throat. The second shattered his cheekbone. The man crumpled backward, choking on his own blood, his shotgun discharging wildly into the ceiling, raining drywall dust down like snow. "Go! Go! Go!" Zio roared, backing toward the kitchen. More footsteps on the stairs. Automatic gunfire erupted, the bullets chewing through the thin drywall of the hallway, ripping into the apartment. The plaster exploded, filling the air with a thick, choking white dust that tasted like chalk and smelled like burning sulfur. Zio dropped to one knee, firing 3 suppressing shots through the wall, aiming blind. He heard a grunt of pain from the hallway, followed by a heavy thud. He spun around. David was already out the kitchen window, standing on the rusted iron fire escape. Chloe was struggling with the heavy, swollen wooden sash of the window. It was jammed. Zio sprinted into the kitchen, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her back, just as a burst of automatic fire shredded the wall behind where she had been standing, destroying the refrigerator and sending a shower of glass and spoiled milk across the linoleum. He didn't try to open the window. He shoved Chloe behind the kitchen island, raised his foot, and kicked the glass. It shattered outward, taking the wooden frame with it. "Out!" he yelled, grabbing her arm and practically throwing her through the broken frame. The jagged edges of the glass tore at his heavy overcoat. He scrambled through after her, his boots hitting the rusted iron grates of the fire escape. The rain was still falling in sheets, immediately turning the white drywall dust coating his clothes into a grey paste. Down below, in the alley, a man in a black windbreaker was aiming a rifle upward. Zio didn't hesitate. He leaned over the railing, ignoring the agonizing drop below him, and fired twice. He missed the first shot, the bullet sparking off a dumpster. The second caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into a puddle. "Down!" Zio shouted at David and Chloe. The fire escape shrieked in protest as the 3 of them clattered down the rusted stairs. The metal was slick with rain, treacherous underfoot. Behind them, a man leaned out of the broken kitchen window, leveling a pistol. Before the man could fire, a heavy, suppressed thwip sounded from the street. The man in the window jerked violently, dropping his gun, and slumped over the sill. Zio looked down. Sal's Lincoln had skidded into the alley entrance, tires smoking on the wet asphalt. Sal was standing behind the open passenger door, a long-barreled rifle pressed to his shoulder. "Get in!" Sal bellowed over the sound of the rain. They hit the pavement. Zio grabbed Chloe by the collar of her oversized sweater, physically shielding her with his body as they sprinted the last 20 yards to the car. A bullet sparked against the brick wall inches from Zio's head, showering his face with red dust. He ignored it. He shoved Chloe into the back seat, David tumbling in after her. Zio threw himself into the passenger seat, not bothering to close the door. "Drive!" Zio yelled. Sal dropped the rifle, threw the car into gear, and slammed on the gas. The massive V8 engine roared, the tires screaming as they fought for traction on the wet street. The heavy door swung shut on its own momentum, locking with a heavy thunk. Zio slumped back against the wet leather, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving a cold, trembling exhaustion in its wake. The car smelled like damp wool, cordite, and copper. He reached up and touched the side of his neck. His fingers came away sticky with blood. A piece of flying plaster or glass had grazed him. He turned around, looking into the back seat. David was curled into a ball, hyperventilating. Chloe was sitting upright. She wasn't shaking anymore. She was staring at Zio's bloody hand, and then up at his face. She looked at the man she had been told was a monster, the man who had just stood in front of automatic gunfire to pull her out of a burning room. "You're bleeding," she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, stripping away the last remnants of the frightened child Elias had created. "It's nothing," Zio muttered, turning back around and staring out the windshield at the rain-slicked streets. He pulled a fresh magazine from his pocket and jammed it into his pistol with a harsh, metallic click. Elias just made his move. "Now, it's our turn." Zio sat in the passenger seat, a wad of coarse brown paper napkins pressed against the right side of his neck. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze, but the skin around the shallow trench was hot and tight. Every time he swallowed, a sharp, needle-like pain radiated down to his collarbone. He didn't care. The pain was a metronome, keeping him awake, keeping the exhaustion at bay. David was curled up in the far corner of the back seat, hugging his knees to his chest. He was violently pale, his breathing a shallow, erratic whistle. The laptop, miraculously still functioning despite its cracked casing, sat open on the seat next to him, the screen illuminating his sweaty face in a pale, ghastly blue. Chloe sat in the middle. She hadn't spoken since they left the garment district. She was staring at the back of Zio's headrest. The oversized wool sweater was still damp, clinging to her small frame, but she wasn't shivering anymore. Her posture had shifted. The huddled, terrified slouch of the alleyway was gone. She sat rigidly straight, her jaw locked. She looked like a soldier sitting in the belly of a transport plane, waiting for the green light to jump. 3 miles, Sal grunted from the driver's seat. His voice was a low rumble over the engine noise. He kept his eyes locked on the treacherous, winding mountain road. The headlights cut through the falling sleet, illuminating towering pines that crowded the asphalt like silent, rotting sentinels. GPS says the main gate is just past the next ridgeline. Zio lowered the blood-soaked napkins and tossed them into the footwell. He unbuttoned his ruined overcoat, pulling his 9mm from the shoulder holster. He ejected the magazine, checked the brass casings by touch in the dark, and slammed it back home. The mechanical click was loud in the confined space. "Tell me about the gate," Zio said, looking back at Chloe over his shoulder. She didn't flinch at the sound of the gun. She blinked, her hazel eyes focusing on him. "It's wrought iron. 12 feet high, walled perimeter. There's a guardhouse set back 20 yards from the gate. 2 men, usually armed with short-barreled rifles, cameras on the pillars, overlapping fields of view. Blind spots?" "None on the approach," she said flatly. Elias made sure of it. But the cameras are wired to a localized closed-circuit hub in the basement of the main house. They aren't cloud-backed. If you cut the fiber-optic trunk line at the junction box just outside the perimeter wall, the screens go black. David whimpered softly from his corner. "You guys are insane. We have the drive. We have the data. We can go to the feds." "The feds work for him," Chloe interrupted. She didn't look at David. She kept her eyes on Zio. "Elias has 3 federal judges and 2 regional directors on retainer. If you hand that drive to the authorities, it disappears into an evidence locker, and we are all dead by Friday." Zio nodded slowly. She understood the mechanics of the world. She had been raised in a cage, but her captor had fed her the brutal, unvarnished truth of how power operated. "Sal," Zio said, turning back to the windshield. "Kill the headlights." Sal reached out and twisted the dial. The world plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the dashboard and the blue wash of David's laptop. Sal drove entirely by the pale reflection of the sleet on the wet asphalt, the heavy sedan gliding like a ghost through the pines. "Pull over here," Zio ordered, as a massive, stone-pillared gate materialized out of the gloom about 100 yards ahead. The Lincoln rolled to a stop on the muddy shoulder. The engine idled with a low, predatory hum. Zio pushed his door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, biting through his damp clothes and stealing the breath from his lungs. He stepped out into the freezing mud. Sal was already out, silently retrieving a matte black, suppressed carbine from the trunk. "David, stay in the car," Zio muttered, leaning back into the cabin. "Keep the engine running. If we aren't back in 30 minutes, drive south. Don't stop until you hit Florida." David nodded frantically, his hands gripping the edge of the leather seat. Zio looked at Chloe. He expected her to stay. He wanted her to stay. He was walking into a meat grinder, and the only objective was to put a bullet between the eyes of the man who had stolen her life. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "No," Zio said. his voice hard. "You stay." "I know the house," she replied, sliding across the leather toward the open door. "I know the floorboards that creak. I know the security patrols inside. You go in blind. You'll trigger a silent alarm before you hit the staircase. It's too dangerous." Chloe stopped in the doorway, the freezing sleet coating her hair. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the undeniable ghost of Sarah in her face, the stubborn, immovable set of her jaw. "He stole my life, Zio," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He told me my father was a butcher. I want to watch you prove him right." Zio stared at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind howling through the pines. He saw the necessity in her eyes. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was an exorcism. She needed to see the ghost die. He stepped back, making room for her in the mud. "Keep your head down," Zio said, "and stay behind me." The junction box was exactly where she said it would be, a rusted metal cabinet hidden behind a thick thicket of frozen rhododendrons. Sal jammed a heavy flathead screwdriver into the lock, torqued it until the metal sheared, and ripped the door open. He took a pair of wire cutters and severed the thick black fiber optic cable. "Cameras are blind," Sal whispered, the sleet collecting on his heavy shoulders. "Take the guardhouse," Zio pointed. "Quietly." Sal nodded, melting into the shadows along the edge of the stone wall. Zio and Chloe waited in the freezing brush. The smell of decaying pine needles and wet earth was overpowering. Zio watched his own breath pluming in the dark. His back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. He was 52 years old, standing in the freezing mud, about to storm a fortress. The sheer absurdity of it tasted metallic on his tongue. A dull, wet thump echoed from the direction of the guardhouse, followed by a heavy drag. 2 minutes later, the side door of the gate clicked open. Sal stood in the frame, gesturing them forward. They slipped through the gate. The compound was vast. The main house sat atop a slight rise, a massive, sprawling structure of dark wood and river stone. Warm yellow light spilled from several windows on the second floor. It looked peaceful. It looked like a ski lodge for billionaires. "Service entrance," Chloe whispered, pointing to a narrow, shadowed walkway that hugged the side of the garage. "It leads into the pantry." They moved fast. The sleet covered the sound of their footsteps on the gravel. Zio kept his pistol raised, sweeping the corners. His heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. The adrenaline had leveled out, leaving behind a cold, hyper-focused clarity. Chloe bypassed the electronic keypad on the service door, reaching down to a small, hidden lockbox bolted near the baseboard. She punched in a 4-digit code, retrieved a physical key, and slid it into the secondary deadbolt. The door clicked open with a soft, well-oiled sigh. The interior of the house smelled of beeswax, cinnamon, and faint cigar smoke. It was intoxicatingly warm. The sudden shift in temperature made Zio's skin prickle. They stood in a massive, stainless steel commercial kitchen. Everything was immaculate. It looked utterly untouched by human hands. "His office is on the second floor," Chloe murmured, barely moving her lips. "East wing. At the end of the hall, there are usually 2 guards stationed outside his door." "Sal," Zio breathed, "take the stairs. I'll take the elevator shaft to the second-floor service corridor." They split. Zio moved through the house with the silent, fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire youth slipping into places he wasn't supposed to be. He followed Chloe up a narrow, carpeted set of servant stairs hidden behind the kitchen pantry. The air grew heavier as they ascended. The smell of cigar smoke grew stronger. They reached the second-floor landing. A heavy mahogany door stood cracked open at the far end of the hallway. Light spilled out onto the Persian runner rug. 2 men in dark suits stood outside it. They looked bored. One was checking his phone, the other was staring at the ceiling. Zio didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadow of the stairwell, raising his weapon. He didn't yell. He didn't give them a chance to surrender. At this range, with a suppressed weapon, it was just geometry. Pfft, pfft. The suppressed shots were quiet, sounding like heavy staple guns. The first guard dropped instantly, his phone clattering to the hardwood floor. The second guard managed to grab the handle of his weapon before Zio put a hollow point through his sternum. He slumped back against the mahogany door, leaving a thick smear of crimson down the expensive wood before collapsing to the floor. Silence rushed back into the hallway. Zio stepped over the bodies. He looked back at Chloe. She was staring at the dead men, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She swallowed hard, but she didn't look away, and she didn't stop moving. Zio reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The office was massive, walls lined with leather-bound books, a roaring fire in a huge stone hearth, and sitting behind a massive oak desk, pouring a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, was Elias. He looked exactly the same. 5 years hadn't aged him a day. He wore a charcoal cashmere sweater. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He didn't look surprised. "Zio?" Elias said smoothly, setting the crystal stopper back into the decanter. He didn't reach for a weapon. He took a sip of his scotch. "I see you found the back door. I always knew your brute force would only get you so far." Zio stepped into the room. He didn't lower his gun. The barrel was pointed squarely at the center of Elias's chest. "Hello, Elias. You owe me a Cadillac." Elias chuckled. A warm, rich sound that made Zio's skin crawl. "I owe you a great deal more than that, old friend." His eyes drifted past Zio, landing on the girl standing in the doorway. The smile widened. "Chloe, darling, you're soaked. Come by the fire." Chloe stiffened. The conditioning, years of psychological dominance, visibly weighed on her. She took a half step backward, her shoulder bumping against the doorframe. "Don't speak to her," Zio said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He stepped to the side, blocking Elias's line of sight to the girl. "Why shouldn't I?" Elias asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "I raised her, Zio. While you were drowning at the bottom of a bottle of cheap rye, mourning a wife who hated you, I was teaching your daughter how to survive the world you built. I gave her an education. I gave her discipline. I gave her a future." "You kept her in a cage," Zio stated. The gun in his hand was heavy, but his aim didn't waver. "A gilded cage," Elias countered, waving his glass dismissively. "Do you honestly think she would have survived in your house, with your enemies? You were sloppy, Zio. You let the Russians push you out of the docks. You let the Irish take the garment district. You were weak. I had to take the reins. The bomb was just business. Taking the girl, that was charity." Zio felt the cold void in his chest crack. The rage, 5 years dormant, surged upward like magma. It wasn't clean. It was messy, suffocating, and blinding. "Charity," Zio echoed. Elias smiled. He moved his hand, sliding it slowly toward the top drawer of his oak desk. "We are men of the world, Zio. Let's make a deal. You leave the drive on the desk, you turn around, and you walk out of here. You can even take the girl. She's outlived her usefulness anyway. In exchange, I let you keep breathing." "No deals." Elias's hand blurred. He didn't pull a gun from the drawer. He pulled a compact, short-barreled shotgun from a magnetic mount strapped to the underside of the desk. Zio fired. The 9mm bullet shattered Elias's crystal glass, exploding scotch and glass shards into the man's face. Elias roared in pain, pulling the trigger blindly. The shotgun blast tore a hole the size of a basketball in the ceiling above Zio's head, showering the room in plaster and burning wadding. Zio didn't shoot again. The rage demanded contact. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, vaulting onto the heavy oak desk and driving his knee directly into Elias's jaw. The leather chair tipped backward. Both men crashed to the hardwood floor in a tangle of limbs and ruined cashmere. It wasn't a choreographed fight. It was an ugly, exhausting brawl between 2 aging predators. Elias was incredibly strong, fueled by panic and adrenaline. He slammed the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun into Zio's ribs. Bone cracked. Zio grunted, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. Zio dropped his pistol. It skittered across the floor, sliding under a leather sofa. He grabbed Elias by the throat with both hands, driving his thumbs into the man's windpipe. Elias thrashed violently, his nails digging into Zio's forearms, tearing through the wet wool and gouging the skin. He brought his knee up, burying it into Zio's stomach. Zio choked, his grip loosening just enough for Elias to roll him over. Elias scrambled up, blood pouring from a deep gash on his cheek where the glass had cut him. He lunged for the shotgun lying on the rug. A heavy, brass fire poker slammed into the side of Elias's skull. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the crackle of the hearth. Elias collapsed instantly, his eyes rolling back in his head, hitting the floor like a sack of wet cement. Zio gasped for air, clutching his broken ribs. He looked up. Chloe stood over Elias's twitching body. She was holding the heavy brass poker with both hands. Her knuckles were bone-white. She was breathing in ragged, gasping sobs. She didn't look horrified. She looked feral. She raised the heavy iron bar again, her eyes locked on Elias's skull. "Chloe!" Zio wheezed. She froze. The poker hovered in the air. "Don't," Zio said. He forced himself up onto his knees. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. "Don't cross that line. You let me do it." She looked at Zio. The absolute, unyielding hatred in her eyes slowly fractured. The heavy iron poker slipped from her grasp, hitting the rug with a dull thud. She backed away, wrapping her arms tightly around her stomach, collapsing against the bookshelves. Zio crawled toward his dropped pistol. His fingers brushed the cold steel. He picked it up, checking the action. He dragged himself over to where Elias lay. The man was still breathing, a wet, bubbling sound. His eyes fluttered open, tracking Zio. The arrogance was gone. Only the stark, empty terror of the end remained. "You burned my life down," Zio said softly. The rage had burned out, leaving nothing but the cold, necessary mechanics of the job. "I'm returning the favor." Zio pointed the barrel at Elias's chest. He didn't aim for the head. He wanted the man to feel the dark closing in. He pulled the trigger twice. The heavy, dull thuds vibrated through the floorboards. Elias jerked, let out a long, rattling sigh, and went entirely still. The smell of copper and burnt powder instantly overpowered the scent of the cedar fire. The drive back to the city was silent. The sleet had turned back into a cold, miserable rain, washing the mud and blood off the chassis of the Lincoln. David had tapped into the car's Wi-Fi. He sat in the back seat, his fingers a blur over the ruined laptop. "The offshore accounts are drained," David reported, his voice hollow and exhausted. "I routed the funds through 7 different dummy shell companies and buried them in the Cayman network. The ledger data, the blackmail files, the political bribes. I dumped them all to the server of the New York Times, the FBI tip line, and 3 independent investigative journalists." "Good," Zio grunted from the passenger seat. He had wrapped his torso tightly with an elastic bandage from the trunk's trauma kit, but every bump in the road felt like a knife twisting in his side. "Elias's network is gone," David continued, closing the laptop. The feds will be kicking down doors from Wall Street to Albany by sunrise. His lieutenants will be too busy running from subpoenas to care who pulled the trigger in the Berkshires. And the compound? Sal asked from the driver's seat. Burning, Zio replied softly, staring out the windshield at the dark highway. Before they left, Zio had emptied 3 canisters of gasoline from the gardening shed over the antique rugs, the leather books, and Elias's body. He had struck a match and watched the flames consume the cage that had held his daughter. The fire was necessary. The words felt different now. They felt like a closing parenthesis. He looked in the rearview mirror. Chloe was sitting in the back, staring out the window at the passing headlights. She looked smaller now. The adrenaline had completely left her system, leaving behind the hollowed-out shell of a survivor who suddenly had no war left to fight. She wasn't a normal teenager. She would never go to a high school prom. She would never complain about curfews. She knew how to scrub a digital ledger, how to bypass an electronic lock, and what a gunshot wound smelled like. Elias had broken her, and Zio couldn't put the pieces back together the way they were supposed to be. But she was his. Zio reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out his silver lighter and the half-smoked cigar he had saved from the diner alley an eternity ago. He sparked the lighter, the small flame illuminating the dark cabin, and took a slow drag. The harsh smoke filled his lungs, grounding him in the immediate, gritty reality of the moment. "Where do we go?" Chloe asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the defensive cynicism she had worn like armor. It was a simple question, with a terrifying amount of weight. She wasn't asking for an address. She was asking for a purpose. Zio blew a thin stream of smoke toward the cracked window. He looked at the bruised, bloodied reflection of himself in the side mirror. The fatigue was still there, settled deep in his marrow, but the dead, numb void behind his ribs was gone. The ledger was balanced. The ghost was dead. Now he had an empire to rebuild, and he had a violent, brilliant, deeply damaged heir to train. "We go home," Zio said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp over the sound of the rain. He turned slightly in his seat, meeting her hazel eyes in the rearview mirror. "We go home, we sleep for 2 days, and then we get to work. We have a city to take back." Chloe held his gaze for a long moment. She didn't smile. There was no tearful embrace, no sudden absolution of the past. But she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and leaned her head back against the leather seat. The Lincoln sped south toward the city, cutting through the dark, leaving the ashes of the past burning brightly in the mountains behind them. Fire in the Berkshires didn't just erase a ghost, it forged a dangerous new legacy. Zio and Chloe's brutal journey from a rain-slicked alley to reclaiming a fractured empire proves that sometimes the only way to survive the dark is to rule it. The Rossi Syndicate is breathing again, and the streets will never be the same. If this raw, uncompromising ride kept your blood pumping, hit that like button and share the video with someone who craves authentic, gritty Mafia drama. Subscribe to the channel right now, so you never miss our next descent into the underworld.